Welcome to the Stranger to Fun photography channel. Today we are going to discuss about the photography lesson, and this is for all the beginners who want to start the photography from the zero level. We are going to start the first chapter, exposure, and the section 1, introduction to exposure. The most confusing part of our camera is learning how to capture a perfect exposure. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all combined together to produce an exposure, and this chapter is going to walk you through how to do that expertly and effortlessly. Exposure in 3 steps. 1. Light passes through the aperture of the lens into the camera. 2. The shutter speed decides how much of the light is going to be recorded onto the camera sensor. 3. The ISO determines how much to increase the exposure by. Every photo has an exposure, and the more you understand about the exposure, the better your photos will be. Once you start to grasp the effect of each aperture, shutter speed, and ISO on a photo, you will be able to use them correctly and creatively. This section covers how to create the right exposure for any situation, as well as the negative consequences of each exposure factor, as well as affecting the exposure. The aperture affects the depth of field. The shutter speed determines whether there's motion blur or freezing. ISO produces digital noise or grain, which in turn affect the quality of the image. All of this combines to produce an exposure like the one in the picture. The aperture is f2, resulting in the shallow depth of field and the soft feel of the photo. The shutter speed is 1/800 of a second, meaning that I could take the photo comfortably without motion blur, and the ISO is only 100, which has resulted in very little noise. Getting the correct exposure using different shooting modes. Every modern camera will have an exposure meter built into it and will be displayed on the screen similarly as the shown image. Different modes use this meter to automatically create the correct exposure. When the needle is in the center, the photo will be exposed correctly. Priority modes. Aperture priority will hold the needle in the center unless you have moved it manually, and as the aperture changes to allow more light in, the shutter speed will also change to allow less light in maintaining an even exposure. The shutter priority mode will do the same thing, only the other way around. Shutter speed is changed, the aperture changes accordingly and automatically. Manual mode. Manual mode allows you to change both the aperture and the shutter speed at the same time without conforming to a certain point on the exposure meter. This mode tends to be used by a more experienced photographer with better knowledge of the setting to use in different circumstances, giving them more control over the photo. You should ensure that you explore this mode, as it will help you to learn photography quickly. The light meter will still move to indicate how well exposed a photograph will be. Different exposure conditions. The one is daylight. This photo has excellent lighting conditions, so you can use fast setting on your camera. This photo was taken at 1/2000 of a second at an aperture of 1.8 and ISO is 64. Photos of scenes at night are best taken using a tripod. This way you can create a long exposure and play with the light without producing blur. This photo was taken using 1/2 second of exposure. Aperture is 4.5 and the ISO is 500. The next one is indoor. You can use the built-in flash or you can use the external flash for the indoor photography, but I shot this image without using flash. With the setting of aperture is 2, exposure time is 1/100 of a second, and the ISO speed is 200.